being here tonight and for listening to our talk. This is something that that Layne and I are we really love talking about. So we're going to have a good time tonight. So I'm going to start here. Hopefully it will go forward. And there we are. All right. Well, as was mentioned, I have nearly 30 years of experience as a water quality professional. I began as a water protection engineer, and it was maybe 10 years on the job when I learned about rain gardens and what they could do to help with flooding and to improve water quality. So as my slide here indicates, I'm a water person, but I've become a bit of a plant person.
And I come in with the plants. So I am an early career landscape designer, but really from a young age, I've been frankly obsessed with plants, and especially native plants over the last 5 years or so. Like was mentioned earlier in the presentation, my background is in landscape architecture. In my coursework at the University of Illinois, I was sort of introduced to the connections that exist between land and the plants like you see here and water, which has really been reinforced over the last 3 years working with Eliana.
Yeah, Layne's work is amazing. I met him as a student, and I think I nearly hired him on the spot after seeing his work. And you will understand why very shortly. So Layne and I collaborate on extension outreach projects that beautify the land, help a butterfly or two while improving water quality. Our goal tonight is to inspire you to see with new eyes regarding what you can do in the land and how it affects the water. Weave through is our experience with the Red Oak Rain Garden, including what motivates us. We'll give you some examples from the demonstration garden, and then finally we'll empower you with tools and resources so you can start making a difference today. So the reason I care about this so much is because I love water. I grew up with friends who had lakefront property, not this one, but it looked a lot like this. And as a kid, I swam in a lake like this. Now here's a picture of me and my friends as a kid. I'm the one on the right. And we were all booted up because the lady that owned the lake and the place here was taking us kids on a creek walk. And creek kind of looked like this one. So you can imagine how much fun we had in our little red boots just stomping around in a creek like this. And from an early age, it really instilled this love of water. And for me, I also just really love rain. And I know here in central Illinois where I am, we got a lot of rain today. I don't know what it was like over in near parts, but we had a lot of rain. And I love rain too. And you know, on a day where like this one, where it's kind of chilly and we're all kind of cozy inside of our houses and it's raining outside, I'm going to introduce you to a word, because there is a word for people that love rain. That's a pluviophile. So it's that I am definitely a pluviophile. I find this joy and peace of mind during rainy days. I do have to admit that there's also this other side to rain that I've experienced, maybe some of you have experienced, and it's anything but fun. So this is a picture, of course, depicting flooding, and that's never a good day. This is actually in my neighborhood where I live, and I had was coming back home from work, and I couldn't even get to my street to pull into my house. There was so much flooding. So the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about how the water cycle works and how that affects things like flooding and water quality. So here's a picture of the natural water cycle. Hopefully I can, there we go, I can have my, my cursor up here. So you see just kind of, you know, this gentle rain that's coming down on the natural environment with trees and grass. Little bit is running off into this creek, and a whole lot is infiltrating or soaking into the ground, and that recharges this groundwater. Now, in a post-development or urban setting, like our cities, it has a much different effect. So the rain is still coming down, but because of the roofs and because of the concrete and the hard surfaces, we get much less infiltration because those surfaces don't let the water soak in, right? So much less groundwater flow, but a whole lot is coming off of these buildings and going into the creeks. And this is what ends up and happens to a creek that is withstanding this amount of force and flow. You end up with a lot of bank erosion, some pollution, and it changes the geomorphology of the stream, which affects aquatic habitat. And that makes it much harder for this little cowboy and his sisters to catch fish.
So Eliana did a great job of describing her why, you know, coming from the world of water. My why comes from, as I alluded to before, the world of plants. And really, this passion for native prairie plants, and you'll have to pardon the pun here, is rooted in the history of the state of Illinois. And after all, I think it's important to remember that the nickname of the state is the Prairie State, right? So let's go back to pre-European settlement. So early 1800s or so. Illinois was home to an estimated 22 million acres of that prairie. So everything that you see on this map in that tan color was prairie, covering nearly 60% of the state. And then we look at it today, and you can notice the change from that tan colored prairie in the last slide to agriculture and development in this slide, which is depicted by yellow and pink respectively. So we're left with less than 1/10 of 1% of that original 22 million acres. Just about 2,500 acres are left of that prairie in the state. So to give it some photo context, this is a prairie restoration at Meadowbrook Park in Urbana. So imagine this scene extending literally as far as the eye can see, that dense variety of tallgrass prairie supporting innumerable species of insect and birds and mammals that adapted alongside each other over millennia. And this is what took its place when we realized just how valuable our soil is in the state. And as we developed, this urban condition became more and more common. So notice how in this image, similar to one of the images that Eliana showed, water's not infiltrating here. The asphalt and concrete parking lot is preventing that from happening. And the water is being shed off of that surface into probably a storm drain. And along with all of that water come the contaminants that are on that parking lot, like brake dust and leaking auto fluids and all of those other kinds of contaminants that come with this urban condition. Another common condition in those urban settings is turf grass or lawns. This is a graphic showing just how much of that lawn there is. And it's really a pretty significant amount. In fact, irrigated lawn is actually the largest irrigated crop in the United States. And that's a condition that most of us are familiar with. I think this graphic does a really great job of showing one of the key differences between lawn and our native prairie plants. If you can see this tiny little plant up here in the top left, that is depicting lawn or turf grass. Notice that they're really, there's not much of a root system on these. Prairie plants, on the other hand, have roots that can shoot down an incredible 15 feet into our soil. And that's part of the reason why our soil across the state is so incredibly fertile. All of that biomass and the movement and cycling of nutrients. Those roots also help to build soil permeability, meaning that the more root systems that you have down here, the more capacity that soil has to absorb and infiltrate larger amounts of water.
Okay, thank you, Layne. So, so now you know our why and why we are so interested in building things like rain gardens. We're going to focus here on the red oak rain garden, but first I'm going to need to define what a rain garden is. So I want to direct your eyes to this, there we go, there's my cursor, to this shallow basin here. And that is capturing this rain runoff, snow melt, and it's allowing it to infiltrate, soak into the ground. That helps mitigate flooding and improves water quality. It also supports pollinators and human well-being. This is good for, it's good for your mental health to have growing things around us. So what is the Red Oak Rain Garden? The Red Oak Rain Garden is a 10,000 square foot demonstration site on the campus of the University of Illinois. It captures rainwater, reduces sidewalk flooding, and provides wildlife habitat and educates campus and community about sustainable landscape design. On our campus, it's an example of a living learning laboratory which enhances the student experience. A little bit of background into the project, and then we'll go into some lessons. So this is where we're located here on the campus at U of I in Urbana-Champaign. We are next door to a couple of dormitories. There's a big parking lot over here with a health center, a detention basin, and then more parking lot. This corridor into campus is utilized by a lot of pedestrians walking into class or biking into class. The garden was originally built in 2006, was a class project from Professor Tony Indress. And here you can see a couple of the students that are shoveling a lot of rock into a wheelbarrow. We're going to talk a little bit more about the stone installation from 2006, but this is a photo of what it looked like right after it was built. You can see some of that stone in there and these little baby shrubs at that time. And unfortunately, the garden was not cared for as it should have been. And so in 2019, we took this photo that was our before photo. This is before the renovation that we did in 2019. Some things I want to point out here. I pointed out the stone in those earlier photos, and here you see weeds that are covering the stone. So the stone is still there. It was actually 60 tons of stone, but you can't see it in this photo because it's covered by a lot of weeds. There's also very overgrown shrubs. So those tiny little baby shrubs that I showed you had not been pruned over the years, and they were not in very good shape. Now I'm going to show you the after photo. This is the first year after the renovation, and we put in a few other shrubs and have a completely different approach to the design. And here are some of our lessons that we learned on the design side. Choosing your site carefully. So this worked out well for us, but as we educate folks about rain gardens, one of the things that we like to talk about is that a lot of folks are oftentimes looking to put a rain garden where you're already seeing some standing water. And here, this is actually water that's coming over that sidewalk where people would walk through. That was one of the reasons why the campus wanted to have something done in this location, because people didn't like to walk through a flooded sidewalk onto their office or to their classes. This is another photo of the before location from right before things were put in. This is the oak tree that the garden is named for. And it's a tree that does not like to have wet feet. So this before condition was not very good for it. A lot of standing water. Something definitely needed to be done in this location, but for a residential application, the standing water might indicate that there is a problem with infiltration, the soaking into the ground. And we'll talk a little bit more about infiltration in some other slides. For this particular application, it worked out just fine to have to build a rain garden here, but it's definitely something that care should and forethought should be given to for building a rain garden. Considering foot traffic. So I'm not sure if you've ever heard this term, pedestrian paths of desire. This is an overview of what the garden looks like or looked like. And this is this little path, that comes up as people walk through the garden. The way that it worked is that people coming from the south trying to get from point A to point B are just going to go to the shortest route. That's how most people do that. It's human nature to just do that, but for this place, it went right through the garden. So here you can see those were forming, and some of the reason that was forming, more coming through. I've walked that myself, and it is definitely the thing that a person would want to do. And that desire is so strong that we even saw that happening in the middle of winter, walking through the slushy areas. So we really knew that something had to be done here. And even on the other side of the tree too. So this is the renovation plan, and it shows that there is a bridge that we decided to put in so that people, as they would be approaching from the south, going from point A to point B, would be going over the bridge. If they're coming from this location and instead of going over that berm, there's a sidewalk on that area as well. And this is a picture of the completed sidewalk. Now, COVID-19 got in the way of us installing the bridge, but we were able to get the footings in, and the bridge is scheduled to be built in May of this year. So we're really looking forward to that. But as I mentioned, Layne is very talented, and he made a beautiful rendering of what the bridge and the garden will look like once everything is completed. Third lesson for design, designing with maintenance in mind. So we're going to talk about the rocks. Okay, this is some of the 60 ton of rock, and this is what things look like originally back in 2006. So then 11 years later, this was the condition. Now, this is a sycamore. It's a London plane tree, and gosh, they're just beautiful trees, but they do like to drop a lot of sticks. And that was not a very good situation for all of this rock. It was just not going to be possible for keeping that very clean. And in that time period that it was originally put in, rain gardens just were typical to have stone-centered designs. And during that time period, a lot of the rain gardens that were built in the northwest of the country, in the Washington and Oregon area. And the stone may work a lot better there, but in the Midwest, we just don't naturally have a lot of stone around here. We have a lot of plants, so it's just a very different kind of situation. And what the rain gardens are aiming to do is to mimic what our pre-development ecosystem is like. I'm also, since we're here, I'm just going to mention that we do have these lovely sculptures in the garden. Some of you folks may be wondering what that is. I don't know what's happening in the chat box because I can't see it, but this is these gorgeous sculptures that signify the prairie fire. So we needed to remove all of that stone, and 60 ton of stone is a lot of stone, and it takes something like this big rig to make that happen. There also was landscape fabric under the stone, and so all of that had to be removed. After the renovation, there's only a very limited number of places in the garden that have landscape fabric. And it's needed in those locations, but we opted not to put it back in because we really didn't need it. We don't have so much stone anymore. What we have instead, so these are some of the guts, right, of the rain garden. What we have instead of stone, and what is the current thing to do for rain gardens, is to have an addition of a soil mix. It's also called an engineered soil, and that is created by adding sand to the original soils and compost. We also added mycorrhizal inoculant. So that's a fungus, and that's really helpful. It's really helpful for making sure that we get the infiltration, the soaking in rates that we want to get to make sure that the rain garden drains well. Our team learned from a USDA social scientist that the aggregates are very important in soils being able to drain. It's important for crops, it's important for rain gardens. And what the soil scientists tell us is that the plants that Layne had mentioned with those long roots create an environment where this mycorrhizal fungus can exist, and that it helps create that good aggregate so that we could get good infiltration. And so that was something that we added throughout the garden. And this is what the garden looks like. This was in August of 2020. And boy, it was just, high summer. But Layne tells me this may have been right after the peak of our first year blooms. But I hope you will all agree that it's just a beautiful, beautiful place to look at. Oh, one more thing I'm going to mention before we come off of designing with maintenance in mind. Layne is going to go do a deeper dive into that in working with the plants instead of the stone-centered design. We now have this plant-centered design, so that will come in a few slides. But for right now, I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about some of the engagement lessons that we learned. So Layne and I both work for Illinois Extension and Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. So outreach and engagement and education is part of what we do. And we integrated that into building the garden. So our first lesson was engaging stakeholder partners. We identified stakeholder partners or stakeholder folks that would have some thoughts about what they might want to see at the garden. And we held 2 input sessions to make sure that we allowed their voices to be heard, and so that we could integrate the wishes and desires of the people that would be visiting the garden, using the garden, walking by the garden. So all of these things that you see on the right were all things that we learned about and that we continue to keep in mind as we go forward with this project. We also were able to foster some pretty amazing partnerships with all these various businesses there on the left, including some really wonderful donors. And I'll just note our website. We'll be giving it again later, but we do have acknowledgements of our donors on that page. And also acknowledging the wonderful partnerships that we've had with our Champaign County Extension Office, the Master Gardeners, the Master Naturalists, and some wonderful volunteers from various academic programs, and our Student Sustainability Committee and Facilities and Services. One other entity I'm going to mention is the Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation. They've been really incredible. We've had a couple of great grants from them. So inviting service learning. Service learning is volunteerism plus education. So the whole idea with service learning is that you are providing training for your volunteers. And here's Layne talking to a group of Horticulture 100 students that are here doing this as part of their coursework. And Layne was teaching them about the garden, what it's going to be, what it's about, and then how to plant plants. Many of these students hadn't really even planted a plant yet. And so this gave them an opportunity to have hands-on learning. And it's not only for the college age people, because our master gardeners and master naturalists were also learning about rain gardens and helping us. Well, they are just essential. They're just really essential for the installation and the continuing care of this garden. Want to talk a little bit about the way that Layne established the garden, which included having this planting grid, and that helped. Well, it's a 10,000 square foot garden, and there is approximately 9,000 plants in it. So that meant about 9,000 holes, right? So there had to be a really good way of organizing all of the plants and getting everything, getting all of those holes dug. Here, speaking of which, here's a picture of Layne with the planting drill. Layne, please feel free to jump in and talk about how interesting it was with the volunteers and the number of holes and trying to keep ahead of them.
Yeah, so just a few slides ago, Eliana showed a group of students that I was speaking to. That afternoon, we had there were 15 students there, and there were 20 students there, and within 15 minutes, those 20 students had installed 350 plants into the holes that I had pre-drilled. So I really had to pick up the pace when prepping for these larger groups of volunteers coming in, so that I had more holes for them to actually plant into. And I could not do it all by myself. So we brought in a whole team of people to drill holes, as you can see here. And even the four of us drilling holes basically at the same time was still not enough. We brought in another good friend of the rain garden, Bill there. But 9,000 holes, it was a lot, but we got it done.
And that's one of the values of having those great partnerships and having the stakeholder engagement, because that really helped us to have already established some of these relationships. So when we needed to call in reinforcements, they were needed, and they came and they were there. That was amazing. The last engagement lesson I'm going to cover is to make sure that you have fun and celebrate successes. If you are going to be building any kind of large garden or even a small garden, it is always important to stand back and look at what you've done and celebrate that. So this is a photo of Karen Folk. She's our lead master naturalist, and she just always has a smile on her face and is a really great example of the lovely energy that our volunteers have been bringing to the stewardship of this project. And one of the things that I really love about this project is that, well, this is of course pre-COVID, but when we installed the garden at the fall of 2019, we had students and community members that were working side by side. I think at one point we were looking around and realized that there were 5 generations all working on the garden. Now, one of them, I think, was somebody's child, so maybe they didn't count, but they were there, so we are counting them. And I tell folks that if they are going to be doing any kind of multi-generational volunteer event, that the key to that success for that is the soundtrack to the Guardians of the Galaxy movie. Because that's 70s music, but many of the millennials have seen that movie, and I guess Gen Z, so they've seen that movie, so they know the songs. So everybody knew the songs, and that was some special magic that we stumbled onto.
Yeah, it's not just the 70s music, it's the best of the 70s.
Yes, it's the best of the 70s music. And here's Layne and myself and 2 of our volunteers right after we had planted the last plug. But the 9,000th plug went in, and boy, you can see the looks on our faces. We were really happy, very happy. We were so happy, and we had also found out from some campus historians that the couple of trees that are at our rain garden were over 100 years old, that we decided to celebrate with a 100th birthday party for the trees, and that also served as our soft opening of the garden. Here we are, just, so happy that things are done. This is our team. We invited others, gave a talk, gave some tours, and of course they had cake. It was a birthday party. What's a birthday party without cake, right? These are some very special cakes that were made by Berries and Flour, a friend to the rain garden, and some of the ingredients are made with plants that can be found in the rain garden, such as spice bush. One of them, I think it was the one on the left, was actually made with the acorn flour. And so these were pretty special, and they were just incredibly delicious. Layne, I'm going to ask you to jump in and talk about the fun of this slide, because this covers when 2020 as the pandemic hit for us.
Well, we're all on Zoom here, so I'm sure that most of us have at least gotten somewhat used to this new virtual world that we're living in. And in the summer of last year, 2020 being 2020, our newly homed monarch caterpillars in the garden, they also needed a good socially distanced way to converse with one another, and they adapted quite nicely to Zoom, as you can see in the screenshot. Monarch J Fox was really having a good conversation with Paul Monarch Bartney. So
I think those are my 2 favorites. So yeah, in the fall of 2020, when the students came back, we were all on Zoom. And one of the things that we did for the residence hall that I mentioned that we live next door to, go to that slide, and then I'll come back to that slide, is we held a socially distant scavenger hunt for them. And some of the things around in August that they could see. We talked to them for, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes, and then we sent them outside and had them find these things and had them take pictures of it. And even our rain gauge was something that we asked them to take a look at. And then they all came back to the Zoom, and they gave a little report out on the things that they saw. We do have in our new sidewalks some leaf pressings, which is kind of nice. And then I want to focus on this mosaic. This is just one of 12 beautiful mosaics that were made by the dormitory, an art class that happens in the dormitory, with our partnership with them, with the instructor, Catherine Wiesner. And they're 12 by 12, and Layne installed them into the decomposed granite edge of the garden. And this is a picture of all of them. And boy, they're really just so gorgeous. Every time I look at them, well, I can never decide which one's my favorite, and they all just blow me over. But I'm going to go back a couple of slides because I had skipped over this one. In that fall of 2020, we also had our first student team, which was made up of students that got course credit for helping us with some scientific studies to help monitor the garden. And they also worked on some social media with us. Okay, so I'm going to pause here to just do the recap on some of our lessons, and then Layne is going to go into the deeper dive. So choosing your site carefully. Maybe water ponding is okay. I didn't mention the under the trees, but under the trees can also be a challenge because of root systems. So you just have, it doesn't mean that it can't happen. It just means that there needs to be careful consideration. Foot traffic, important to when you're doing a big public site like this, and designing with maintenance in mind. For the volunteer portion of things, the engagement portion of things, stakeholder partners are important. Service learning is an amazing thing, and have fun and celebrate your successes. So Layne, I think I hand that over to you now.
Perfect. Thank you, Eliana. So now we're starting to get an idea of what rain gardens are, but let's move into, actually thinking about the design concepts and the different aspects that go into those when you're thinking about putting in a rain garden even on your own property. But before we get into those big design concepts, I just want to get a couple of key points out there now. So first of all, when you're thinking about these kinds of gardens, make sure to keep in mind the size of the space that you have to work with. And really, no matter the size, try to limit the number of species that you're going to be using from the beginning. Now, that doesn't mean to only use 3 plant species, but be mindful that having too many species in one space can cause the garden to become unwieldy or messy, and sometimes difficult to maintain as well. If in 3 years or so, when the garden reaches maturity, you want to come in and add to your color palette, or if you want to try out some new plant combinations, that can totally be done. In fact, I would highly encourage that, but wait until those original plants that you installed have a chance to fill in and you've gotten used to the maintenance practices that come along with them. The second point is to always remember right plant, right place. While many of our native species are fairly adaptable, and I will discuss some of that here in a few minutes, it's always the right thing to remember that phrase, right plant, right place. Always be mindful of your light and moisture conditions when picking out your plants to use in the garden. And finally, I think it's important to mention this because I see it all too often in native plant gardens. A decent number of native plant species tend to get quite tall. And if they're planted too close to the front of the garden, they can add to a messy look when they inevitably flop over onto the sidewalk or onto the lawn by late summer, as their foliage and their blooms tend to pull those tall stalks down. So one species in particular that comes to mind is something like New England aster, which is a really great species for pollinators and all of that, but the straight native species has a tendency to overperform and eventually flop over. So if you are going to use a species like that, just remember to keep it towards the back of the garden. I promise that your garden will stay tidier for longer. So moving on into the real design concepts. The first concept I want to talk about today, specific to rain gardens, is the use of what I'm calling the third dimension, which basically means we're going to think about how the depth of a rain garden, remember it's a bowl shaped. So thinking about how the depth of the garden informs which plants you should be using. So rain gardens have 3 planting zones: basins, slopes, and banks. And I will go into each of those in detail. The first that we'll look at is the basin planting zone. So the basin is located at the lowest elevation in the rain garden. And since it is at that low elevation, it's going to be the location that gets the most amount of water in it. It's going to be the wettest location in your garden. Water might pool there for fairly long periods of time. I usually tell people that it should be less than 24 hours, which minimizes damage that can be done to plants and their root zones. But it also helps to make sure that you're not encouraging mosquitoes and things of that nature. So plants in the basin planting zone, they really need to be adapted for wet conditions. However, being in Illinois, and we still have extended periods of dryness. We do experience some levels of drought here in the state. So even plants in the basin need to have some ability to withstand drought conditions. And luckily, Illinois is home to a whole variety of species that work for just those kinds of conditions. I will talk about just a few of them, such as common rush and blue flag iris, 2 really wonderful species. Here they are pictured at the Red Oak Rain Garden just after being installed. And this past summer, you can see how nicely they filled in. We did not get our blooms on those irises yet, as you can see here, but hopefully this growing season will get some incredible blooms from those irises. A species like swamp milkweed is one of those that is a great example of a plant that should be in the basin of a rain garden. It is adapted for those wet conditions, but it can also withstand some periods of dryness, in periods when we don't have quite the heavy rains that we might experience in the spring, for example. I'll also mention here that we will be talking about some resources that you can use at the end of this presentation to direct you to a much wider variety of plants for these different zones that will come at the end of the presentation today. The next planting zone that I will talk about is the slopes. And that's basically going to be a step above the basin when looking at the rain garden. So the slopes surround the basin. And as I said, they sort of increase in elevation. So in heavy rain events, flooding might occur, but that zone is typically going to stay at your average moisture levels. As the water is infiltrating, it's going down, which is why the basin stays the wettest longest. The slopes might get some, flooding inundation for some period of time, but it's not going to be quite as much as what you'd get in the basin. So plants in this zone need to be adapted for average soil conditions, so not too wet, not too dry, but they also need to be able to tolerate some periods of water inundation. And again, we have some wonderful plants for these conditions like black-eyed Susan and purple coneflower. The third zone is the bank planting zone. So this is basically the top of the rain garden. This is your highest elevation, and therefore it is also the driest location. So this zone should not experience standing water even after heavy rain events, which is why plants on the banks need to be adapted for average to more dry soil conditions. Plants like butterfly weed and pale purple coneflower are prime examples of plants that work well in these kinds of conditions. So that's a little bit about the third dimension. I'm going to now move into another concept, which is designing in layers. And this is a central method for the planting of the red oak rain garden. And you'll see why here in just a moment. This method of designing in layers is really beautifully laid out by Thomas Rainer and Claudia West in their book, Planting in a Post-Wild World. If you have not heard of this book or if you've not checked it out before, I would highly recommend it. Planting in a Post-Wild World, it's just an incredible book and quite inspirational for any gardener. So these layers, right? There are 3 that are laid out specifically in Thomas Rainer and Claudia West's book. The ground cover layer, the structural layer, and the seasonal layer. And I will add on a 4th layer to those that I will go into detail each individually. So that first layer, the ground cover layer. This is a graphic showing that ground cover layer. And one of the key points that I want you to take away from this graphic is just how much of the real estate in the garden is actually covered by this. It's nearly the whole surface, right? This graphic shows a lot of grassy textures, but I promise there's a whole variety of really great textured species that you can work with. These are typically going to be the shortest plants in the garden. As those short plants cover that amount of real estate, they form what we call a green mulch. And that can be for aesthetics, that can be for weed suppression. I like to look at it as being both. I think this ground cover layer is beautiful, but I also appreciate the functionality of it in the fact that it does a phenomenal job of suppressing weeds by making sure that they are shaded out. So having that amount of green mulch probably means that you're going to need to use a lot of individual plants. And that's totally okay. And when I design these kind of gardens, I'm usually looking at 60 to 70% of the plants for that garden. They're going to be plants that are in the ground cover layer. As I mentioned, they're the shortest plants in the garden. And when first installed, they're usually going to be densely planted to help form that green mulch quickly. As those plants fill in and mature, they start to protect the soil from erosion. They provide habitat for overwintering pollinators and a lot more. So to give you a visual on this, this is the ground cover layer at the Red Oak Rain Garden pictured in May of last year. So this is the spring following the installation. And even just several months after being installed, you can see, especially in the foreground here, that the ground is already becoming covered by the different sedges and plants that we've got in this layer. And you can just see the number of individual plants that we've got. There's still some growing that needs to happen here, but hopefully, in the next year or two, we will have an entire ground cover established. We will give you links to our full plant selection at the rain garden towards the end of the presentation. But for now, just to give you an idea of what we've got and the diversity that exists in this ground covered layer, this is what we've got at the Red Oak Rain Garden. And I will cover just a few of those species. One of my favorites is Pennsylvania sedge, which has this really nice, airy, grassy texture. It's a fairly adaptable sedge that can exist in both sunny and shady conditions. It's also got some semi-evergreen tendencies, so it sort of has that added benefit of having some seasonality even into the winter months. We can also have ground cover species that bloom. Jacob's ladder is a species that I find to work really nicely in the ground cover layer. It's got some great foliage that contrasts nicely against the grassy textures of the sedges. And plus, you just can't go wrong with those really nice, sort of delicate looking blooms that, now we're in mid-March, aren't all that far off. You can also have ground covers that are incredibly showy. So this is purple poppy mallow, native to the southern half of the state, but grows quite nicely throughout the state. It just comes on in early summer with this brilliant display of fuchsia flowers that lasted into August for us. So multiple months of really showy displays of flowers. And I can attest, it just did an incredible job of keeping the weeds at bay. I threw this ground cover in because I think it's one that a lot of us are familiar with as gardeners. This is prairie alum root, Heuchera richardsonii. And if you recognize that name, Heuchera, it is a parent of the commonly used shade plant coral bells, one plant that a lot of us, again, are familiar with. This is one of its native parents, and it's got this really great dark green foliage throughout the growing season that transitions to a wonderful variety of fall colors that lasts through the winter. We are getting ready to clean up the garden for spring, and still here in mid-March, this alum root still has this really amazing red foliage. So that's just a bit on the ground cover layer, and to give you a good description of some of the varieties that you can have in that layer. And I'll continue that on now with the structural layer, which is basically the opposite of what we were just talking about. These are going to be the tallest plants in the garden. Notice in this graphic that they are not taking up nearly as much real estate across the garden. There are fewer individual plants. And what those individual plants do is begin to form the backbone of the garden. So this is the layer where you find your shrubs, even your trees, your tall forbs and grasses, even plants that can stand through the winter. They fall into this structural layer. And again, individual or small groupings of these plants, that's really where you get your greatest visual impact. And I think I will have a picture in here that does a good job of describing that. But as with the ground cover layer, these are the structural layer species that we have at the rain garden. A lot of different shrubs, and as well as some tall forbs like compass plant. It gets to be 7 feet tall. A really incredible native prairie plant. The structural layer is also where I really like to have fun with 4-season interest when it comes to shrubs with red stems or berries. Here's that picture I was talking about that I think does a great job of showing the structural layer. This is rosinweed, a staple of the Illinois prairie. And this plant is best highlighted when standing in small groups. So here you can see these two standing stalks of brilliant yellow flowers. And if there were to be 70 of these, you would sort of lose the visual impact that you get by seeing the whole sort of silhouette of the plant here against the background of this photo. I always like to point out the bumblebee up here on the top left, a really great pollinator plant as well. I can't give a presentation and not talk about my favorite shrub, red chokeberry. We've got quite a few of these in the Red Oak Rain Garden. It really is a true 4-season shrub. Got these amazing white flowers in the spring, good structure with the stems and its upright growth habit. In the summer, it's got the onset of the berries, which have not yet turned red, but I promise they will. Some good glossy green foliage. And then, of course, in fall, the berries turn to their red and really outstanding fall foliage from this red chokeberry. Fall point 2, when the leaves drop off and the berries begin to take center stage. And then as the snow begins to fall, just beautiful scenery that you can get and build with these red chokeberries. And by the time February comes around, I was pretty excited to be at the garden when a flock of returning robins came in and consumed every last berry that we had in the garden. And that was bittersweet. I was glad to see them enjoying it, but sad to see those berries go. The third layer that we'll talk about today is the seasonal layer. And that is basically what fills in the space between the ground covers and the structural layer. So the seasonal layer features plant species that are visually dominant for a period of time. And a lot of the species in this layer are going to be our more familiar wildflower types like black-eyed Susan and purple coneflower. They're very showy for a period of time through in the year. And typically when working with this layer, you're going to want to group those species in larger groups and masses to create a stronger visual appeal. As with the other layers, this is our seasonal layer in the red oak rain garden. And again, we will put a link to our species list in the chat box at the end of the presentation. Black-eyed Susan, you can see, I think in this photo, there are 5 individual Black-eyed Susan plants. And you can tell even just from this quick snapshot, the sort of oomph that you get when you do a larger grouping of individual plants instead of just having one Black-eyed Susan standing on its own. Royal catchfly is another one of those species that I can't give a presentation without mentioning. It's an endangered Illinois species, and really just it makes for a terrific garden plant. And with that red foliage, it's flower. It's a really great species that I like. Your yellow coneflower, gray-headed coneflower, your purple coneflower, and of course butterfly weed, which is a favorite at the Red Oak Rain Garden. The last layer that I want to talk about today is one that's not specifically mentioned by Rayner and West in their book, but I think it's sort of deserving of its own layer, and that is the ephemeral layer. So ephemerals are species that emerge in their spring. They sort of do their thing, you know, they flower, and in the heat of the summer, they go dormant. So basically, they disappear over the summer months, and I have disappear in quotes because they don't actually disappear, but their foliage and it dies back to the soil level, and they don't come back out until the following spring. But because they quote unquote disappear, they do need to be intermixed with ground covers that can fill those voids that they leave. One such example of an ephemeral that I think a lot of us are familiar with is Virginia bluebells. The first blooms of this species are just a few weeks away. And I don't know about you, but I just can't wait to walk out into the woods and finally get to see these in bloom again. It's been a long winter. There's also species like Dutchman's breeches, which is another common woodland spring ephemeral in the state. And so you can really bring in some great early spring color and interest with species like these ephemerals. And Illinois is home to a whole host of different ephemerals, from our trilliums to shooting star, some of the more commonly used plants in native plant gardens. And a great way to learn about some of the native plants that I've talked about today, and you might even see some familiar pictures. Our Red Oak Rain Garden is hosting its second annual Mulch Madness competition, which is a spin-off of March Madness, of course, the NCAA basketball tournament. But in this tournament, we are pitting one plant species against another. We include some information about them. We do polls between the two to see who wins. And the games will be ongoing on our social media through the beginning of April. So if you haven't already checked it out, check us out at go.illinois.edu/mulch madness, or follow us at Rain Garden UIUC on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Okay, thank you, Layne. That was amazing. So we are going to set you all up for success and get you started by talking about how you might do a rain garden at your own place. I do want to say that in the time that we have today, that we can't tell you everything about rain gardens, but there is this great program that Illinois Extension is adapting from Purdue called Rainscaping, which is a 15-hour course. I'm coordinating this statewide effort and working with county offices to start offering it locally this year. So look for that. But we are going to, in the next few slides, get you started on how you might do a site analysis at your place. So if this is just a typical house surrounded by a lawn, the large driveway, and you could do this yourself by going on Google Earth, finding your place, or just taking a piece of paper and drawing a square on it representing your house. The first thing that you would do is go outside and identify where your downspouts are. Second thing that you would do is notice where your roof is draining, what portions of the roof are draining to which downspouts. And then be thinking about the water flow and then where it flows out of the downspout. Okay, a couple of things I want to talk about here. The flow is coming off the property and going away from the house, which is good. Water plus house is not good. It's also coming down off of this driveway, quite a bit of it, and it's going into the street where it can go into the storm drain. So one of the quick things that a person could change is just the direction of that downspout in order to not have so much flow going into the street. Now, of course, you would need to do a few things to make sure that the water would be okay here, and we'll give you some resources on that. But these are just things to consider. Where would you put a rain garden in this place? Not within 10 feet of the foundation. Again, we really want to protect that house and make sure that we wouldn't be creating some additional problem. We want to keep it away from the foundation. But here's one possibility. Take the water that's coming off into the backyard and put it into a large rain garden back there. There's another possibility and one more. Thing I would like to note on this one is because it is near the street, you're in the right of way, and there are some special considerations like a Julie call that should be done to make sure that you wouldn't be building the garden over any utilities. There's digging that is involved with this, so you have to be careful with that. There's also can be some height restrictions along the street. So you would want to contact your municipality to find out if there's anything like that. We have talked about water flowing into these gardens, but one thing I also want to point out is that some gardens, if they're getting a lot of water, might want to have an outlet. In this particular example, the outlet is pretty conveniently located near that storm inlet. So if you were a drop of water, you would be flowing here on this roof, flowing out of that downspout into the garden. And then if there was a whole lot of rain, you could overflow to the storm drain rather than causing some sort of local flooding issue. But that is very site specific, and not all rain gardens have an outlet. And we've been talking about infiltration, and this is a a really great resource, and it's actually a sneak peek from that rainscaping course that I mentioned. You can go to that, goillinois.edu/Purdue. This was produced by Purdue. This is Dr. Jane Frankenberger, who goes through the steps of doing an infiltration test on your property. And she talks about how to properly size a rain garden based off of the size of the roof. And she goes through how to do that. The infiltration test is really important because it does let you know if the ground is going to allow the water to soak in fast enough. Rain gardens are designed to drain before the mosquitoes can lay their eggs. And as Layne pointed out, to make sure that they drain fast enough for the plant conditions. And the infiltration test is really important to achieve that. So we're going to give an example from a class that landscape architecture professor Gail Fulton did several years ago that I was in. And in this particular case, we were doing those steps. We were looking at the water that was coming off of the house, going into this gutter, and then coming down into the downspout, and then where it might go. And also considering the driveway. So then he created this alternate flow path for the water. In this particular example, there is sawing of the concrete so that you could capture some of the water off the driveway. I've never personally done that, but that is what's included in this example. And then he has the water flow into this rain garden. And then there's an overflow into the street with a curb cut. And this is what his rendering of what the garden would look like. So now we are going to ask you to get active in the chat box and ask you to throw some things in the chat box that you might consider with this particular example. So what might you change with this downspout? Oh, yeah, we could absolutely redirect that downspout to the right. And this is what that would look like. So you would be redirecting that flow. And then this location here, let's just say that this is 10 feet. Yeah, it could absolutely be diverted into this turf area. And then you might want to consider that this could be, it could be a good location for that rain garden if you've done the infiltration test and just made sure that, that the conditions would be okay for that. The caveat, of course, that I always put on here is that it would only be okay if there's no underground utilities that would get in the way. And I always encourage people to do that Julie call and that infiltration test. Oh, consider why the grass is brown. That's a really great comment on there. The grass is brown in this in this situation because I took the photo about 2 weeks ago. So I think it was just from the winter for that particular case. Yes, and definitely make it longer than, at least 10 feet. 10 feet is just a rule. Some folks, if you have a problem with a basement, I would go way farther out for sure. Let's see, any other questions as I'm looking into the chat box. Okay, great. All right, so with this rain garden plan here, one impediment for folks that really want to do the right thing is they aren't Layne, they're not a designer, and they want to do the right thing, but they just don't know quite what that might be. The design concepts are really helpful, but some folks just would just like to have a plan and just do that. And if you are that person, we've got you. So Layne, I'm going to toss that back over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Eliana. So our team has been working on a large series of brochures and designs a few of which have already been published. They include a general guide to a selection of native plants to Illinois, the brochure here on the left. We also have design plans for a full sun pollinator garden and a full sun rain garden. And I will be putting the links to these in the chat box here in just a moment. But for now, I'll walk you through the full sun rain garden brochure. So there's the cover. On the inside, you'll find a plant selection with an attribute table here on the bottom right that details the preferred light and soil conditions for each plant species, as well as the attractions for each of them in regards to bees and butterflies, hummingbirds, and birds. The planting design at the top left takes into account all of the layers that and zones, for that matter, that I talked about in the middle of the presentation. So you don't have to do any of the thinking, it's already been thought. And it's also important to think about four-season interest with these kinds of gardens. So not just what it looks like at its peak, but also remember that gardens can look beautiful in the winter months as well. And this plan takes that seasonality into account. The back page lists additional resources where you can learn more about rain gardens. There are also some planting options for smaller spaces. And there's also a section on where you can find native plants. I know that is a question that is commonly asked. The Illinois Native Plant Society does a really wonderful job of advertising local native plant sales across the state. And it's also important to remember that there are online sources for a lot of these plant species as well. Again, these are just part of a much larger series that we're currently working on. We have a series of woodland brochures, so the more shaded conditions that are very close to being published. So we're excited to have those out in the near future. And Eliana, I think I throw it back to you one last time.
Okay, thank you, Layne. So I had those links available, so I went ahead and put them into the chat box.
Great, thank you.
Yes, well, okay, so Layne and I working for a university, it would be very common for us to assign homework, and we're giving you some homework. It's optional homework, but we think you'll like it. So number one is to attend the rest of the Think Spring Gardening series. This is a great series. What an incredible lineup. We're really honored to have been part of this. Number two, draw that square on a piece of paper that I mentioned before, because I'm going to ask you tomorrow, not now, it's dark out now. So tomorrow, or maybe if it's not raining, I'm not sure what the weather forecast is, go outside. Go outside, and what I'd like for you to do is look around, look at your place, mark your downspouts, mark your driveway. Any sorts of things that should be noted on there on your page, just put it on your page. And then I like for you to consider some possibilities, think about them, dream about them, and then plan what you might do there. You can get some extra credit by looking at that infiltration test video and maybe doing one. Calling Julie to see if you have any utilities before you go very far in your plan. And we always encourage everyone to look at the resources that we're putting in the chat and learn more. Our last thing that we would ask is we really encourage you to play the Mulch Madness. It's really fun, and you get to vote on which plants you like the best until we come down to the final forb. And that's everybody is very excited when that happens. All right, well, that may be the last pun of the evening, so we will go to the last slide and just thank you all so much for having us here. And Nikki and Alex, I'm not sure if we should go to the chat box and see if there's any questions.
Yes, go ahead. There was one question a a ways back, somebody asking, where was the source of your plants? And elaborate. You said 9,000 plants were planted in the garden?
Yeah, that's right. Eliana, I think I can take this one.
Please do.
So a lot of our plants came from nurseries in the Chicago area. So we used Possibility Place Nursery, we used Pizzo Native Plant Nursery, we used one from out further east called North Creek Nurseries, and we also used Midwest ground covers. That's just a few of the native plant nurseries that there are to choose from, but we had really great success with them. And they've got wonderful selections of native plants. I know that some of them may be wholesale only, so your larger projects like we were involved with, but I know that Midwest Ground Covers in particular does a pretty good job of making plants accessible to the general population as well.
I see somebody has asked if this can be done over a septic tank area, and generally the recommendation is not to do it over a septic tank area.
Great question.
Yes. I'm curious if any folks on the program happen to have a rain garden. Oh, there's a good question for you, Layne.
Oh, let me get it open.
They want to know if the Red Oak Rain Garden project is in the sun.
Sure. So it being a 10,000 square foot rain garden, we actually have quite a variety of light conditions, which is really great when you're the plant person and want to use a lot of species, right? Because about half of our garden is in full sun and the other half is in full shade. So there's basically your two extremes. So we have basically a whole woodland selection of native plants. Thanks, Eliana, for pulling that up. So our woodland plants can be found, under the canopy of the red oak tree and the sycamore tree. And then our full sun plants, you can see there's quite a variety here in the foreground of the photo. I'll also mention that the brochure series that that our team has been developing is based, at least in part, on the plant selections that we have here. So the full sun rain garden and the full sun pollinator garden brochures that we have discussed here today take into account a lot of the species that we used here in the sun section. And the woodland series that is nearing publication includes a lot of the species that we used under the canopy of the trees.
Oh, so the question is would a rain garden work if the tubing fitted to the gutters that go under the ground and out, let's see, I'm sorry. Would a rain garden work if the tubing fitted to the gutters that go under the ground and out to the edge of the lawn? Yeah, potentially, you would really want to consider it. And if you're talking of the edge of the lawn that's near the street, you would want to make sure that you have those considerations for the right of way. But it could do that. So there's a couple of folks that are sending me direct messages. I'm assuming that it would be okay to mention those. Somebody wants to know about a shady rain garden and what recommendations. So I would recommend that you go to, and I don't know, Layne, if you would, maybe I could take them there. Go to the plant collection that's on the Rain Garden website and look for cell 2 and 3 because those are the shady plants.
Sure.
And then the person that asked, and so I can stop sharing. So the person that asked about shady, that implies that you would be perhaps under some trees. So you would really want to make sure that that you are doing some careful consideration with the roots. For the red oak rain garden, we were very lucky that horticulture educator Ryan Pankow was willing to help us out with mapping our tree roots so that we would not be harming them. It doesn't mean that you can't do a rain garden under trees, but you just have to be careful. So there are, Layne is showing some of the beautiful shade plants that could work in that for that kind of application. And it's cell 2 and 3, right, Layne?
Correct, yes. I'll also mention, now that I have this up, I have been keeping track of the plants in each season. So the name of this collection is the Fall 2020 collection. So these are actual photos of our actual plants in the fall, which is why some of the species you see may not be blooming. So I was looking for cardinal flower in particular, and clearly fall is past its peak bloom season. So it doesn't look quite as beautiful as it would in the summer months in this photograph here. So I may be rethinking a little bit of this, but there are some great plant species in here that work for those the shady conditions. The lobelias in general, cardinal flower and great blue lobelia, are two really nice flowering plants that do well in the more shady conditioned wet rain gardens. There are also some ferns and different sedges that work, and there are some really wonderful shade shrubs that work for usually the banks of a rain garden. Buttonbush is one such example. Spice bush is really a lovely, lovely native shrub. There are some great cultivars of that one as well. And of course, you've got species like winterberry here with those brilliant red berries. Good shade species.
I know we are coming up close to 8 o'clock, and one person has asked, maybe you could answer this one as well, Layne. It's, what are the tall plants in the sun area? So I'm not sure if you want to come back to the plant collection, or if I should push. Yeah.
Maybe Eliana, if you could pull up your the picture
one?
garden.
Yep.
Yeah. And then
Okay.
I'll take control of the screen. I will
Gotcha.
Point out a couple of the species here. So it's a little hard to tell from this photo, but we've got, as far as our taller plants go, prairie rosinweed and compass plant are the yellow blooming plants here. And this is just before they really put on their show. Another week or so later, and this plant right here would be about a 5-foot tall spire of yellow, brilliant yellow flowers. Our compass plant, which is this single yellow flower here. Remember that these are only 2-year-old plants, so they're yet to reach maturity. But compass plant here can get to be 7 feet tall and have the same colored, really nice yellow flowers. We've also got, as far as height goes, our shrubs in the sunny area with red chokeberry, my favorite shrub that I talked through. I think I had 5 slides on it, maybe 6. Is the shrub here on the left. We've also got
it's worth every slide.
Right. We've also got some red twig dogwood just further in the background of this image. We don't have a whole lot of super tall plants here, besides the shrubs and the rosinweed and compass plant species, because we wanted to make sure that we were keeping most of this fairly open. We are on a campus, so we have to be pretty careful about the amount of height that we have in the garden, just in terms of there's some public safety issues that we have to consider, and just general maintenance practices that we have to consider as well. So we just have just a few selections of species that get over 4 feet throughout most of the garden.
There's one other thing in the chat box.
The red chokeberry sprout. So red chokeberry does sucker, but typically, and you will find that more with the straight native species, most red chokeberry that you will find for sale is going to be a cultivar, which is in this case a good thing. Brilliantissima is one of the common red chokeberry varieties that I really like, and the suckers of the straight native species might spread a bit, but you're not going to have quite as much spread as what you can get with some of the super aggressive species. My experience with maples spreading is I've got a couple of silver maples in my backyard that are about 80 years old, and they spread by seeds, and a lot of them. Luckily, the red chokeberries do not have that quite that capability. Plus, the birds come in and get those seeds before they can do a whole lot within the garden itself.
Gosh, these are such great questions. You all have just been a really wonderful group to speak with. I'm going to stop sharing here, and there we go. Layne, are there any parting words that you would like to say? I want to also thank Nikki and Alex for inviting us. This is just it's been really great.
Yeah, absolutely. I second that, Eliana. Thank you everyone for having us here tonight. Hope you enjoyed the program. And as Eliana said, you were a great audience. Thank you so much.